My research presentation assignment is on cannons. Originally, my focus was on unique weaponry during the 16th century, and from that perspective, one of the most unique and hard to obtain weapons was the cannon. And this is for a few reasons. Cannons were relatively new to Japan in the 16th century, and they were difficult to acquire and make. Most battles before 1543 had warriors using spears and bows and swords. But after the introduction of guns to Japan in 1543 by either the Portuguese or whoever else, apparently it's still some debate as to who the people were who ended up on the shore of Japan. But the introduction of guns would lead to some pretty radical and drastic developments with weaponry and military techniques. But cannons were actually introduced in the 1550s because of the Nanban trade. Two different kinds of breech-loaded cannons were introduced to Otomo Sorin. Each consisted of a heavy barrel on a swivel, and both were breech loaders. The powder and what was being shot out was loaded into the top of the breech by a separate cylinder with a handle welded on, which isn't as efficient as a muzzle loader. These early European models were called Ishibiya, but eventually the Otomo clan called them Kunikuzushi, which means country destroyer. And because the Otomo clan got these cannons before anyone else, they started using these cannons for coastal defense. Some of these cannons were made entirely with bronze, some were made with wrought iron. Sometimes these cannons could weigh as much as 120 kilograms, while also being around 1.5 to 3 meters long. And a lot of these earlier cannons were probably based on Chinese models according to the research that I did. So while the Japanese were able to acquire some cannons, they struggled to copy these cannons and recreate them or remake them. So a lot of these cannons were traded for. One of the main difficulties in using cannons during this time period was that they were incredibly heavy and extremely difficult to transport. Japan being, heavily forested, having lots of mountains and hills, it became pretty difficult trying to move these cannons through and over the terrain. Because some of these cannons were very heavyweight, they were actually fitted onto boats and used for naval warfare. Japan started to actually develop their own artillery instead of specifically just relying on the ones that they traded for. So they actually ended up creating some of their own muzzle-loading weapons. These cannons were called either Harakan or most famously Ozutsu. So here's a few of the unique ones. Some are large caliber, heavy muskets, while some are more akin to cannons. These could either shoot cannonballs or even arrows, and these are sometimes used to destroy gates or barricades. There's also shorter Ozutsu that were even fitted with a gun stock and fired like a handheld firearm. Shorter versions were obviously a bit lighter, and some were actually potentially stronger than some of the bigger cannons. And on the field, these gun versions were sometimes fired off of some form of a tripod or by letting the weapon actually rest on the shoulder of another soldier. But this shorter Ozutsu, when it's used to shoot arrows, it's actually called a bohia. Instead of a cannonball, there'd be a large incendiary arrow, or sometimes compared to rockets. They were actually ignited with a slow burning fuse, and once it hit its target, it was capable of setting enemy ships on fire. So these are some of the smaller unique cannons. There's some that are a lot bigger. There were some that rested on a wooden sliding mount, which would help absorb the recoil of the cannons after they fired. And these weapons were called Taiho. And because these ones were so massive, most of these were pulled onto a battlefield on a cart, usually pulled by oxen. So the Taiho is the type of cannon that was pretty difficult to transport. And then another random cannon that I came across that I thought was pretty interesting was the wooden cannons, known in Japan as mokuho. Basically, instead of, iron or bronze, they're just made out of wood. They were cheap and a lighter alternative. So although cannons are a very unique part of the weaponry used in 16th century Japan, they weren't actually used as much as I initially thought they were. I found two examples where cannons played a major impact in a battle. The first event was the 1558 coastal defense of Bungo province. And basically what happened was the Otomo clan defended the coastline of Bungo against a naval force of several hundred boats. But they were able to use some of these imported cannons to defeat the attacking fleet. And the second significant event where cannons were used to a pretty effective degree is actually the Siege of Osaka in 1614 and 1615. The history behind this one is that this was final battle between the Toyotomi and the Tokugawa families. Basically, Toyotomi Hideyori was down to his final holdout at Osaka Castle, but Ieyasu Tokugawa, according to the lore, maybe this isn't true or not, but 300 cannons were used during the Siege of Osaka in 1614, but that could be an over-exaggerated detail. But either way, Tokugawa Ieyasu had imported European cannons, and he most certainly used several English and Dutch cannons during his Osaka campaign. And he would bombard the castle day and night. Apparently though, these cannons didn't damage the stone foundation too heavily, but they were said to damage its wooden buildings and demoralize the fortress defenders. So these are the two biggest examples I could find of cannon usage in some of these battles during the 16th and 17th century. Cannons were used in a few other battles, but they weren't as significant as I originally thought they maybe were. While cannons were a very unique weapon in the 16th century, it seems to me like their impact that they had on a battle wasn't worth the cost to either make one or trade for one, as well as trying to transport these cannons around Japan. It seems like they had more impact on naval battles overall. And that's all I have to say about cannons.